Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. There's a strange allure to the unknown. For years, I'd sought out places untouched by modern conveniences, where the quiet was absolute and the air carried the scent of raw earth. So when I found the listing for a secluded cabin advertised as off-grid, I didn't hesitate to book it. Little did I know, my craving for solitude would lead me to a nightmare I couldn't escape. The cabin was exactly as the listing described, remote, rustic, and utterly cut off from the world. It was just what I wanted. Or so I thought. The directions were oddly specific, involving an unmarked gravel road and a distinctive oak tree with a scarred trunk. But I found it. The cabin stood alone, a squat wooden structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The air was still, heavy with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A small fireplace, a worn couch, and a kitchenette with mismatched dishes. No cell service, no Wi-Fi. Perfect for a weekend of solitude. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I settled in with a book, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. But as the hours stretched on, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. It started subtly, like a faint hum at the edge of my hearing. I brushed it off as the natural sounds of the forest. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. Low, murmuring sounds, rising and falling in an indistinct rhythm. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The night was silent. Too silent. Even the usual forest noises, crickets, owls, were absent. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The whispers grew louder as the night deepened. They seemed to come from the forest, circling the cabin. I couldn't make out the words, but there was an urgency to them, like a warning. I tried to sleep but couldn't. My heart raced with every sound. The old floorboards creaked as I paced the room. I checked the windows repeatedly, peering out into the pitch-black woods. Nothing moved. And yet, the whispers persisted. Around midnight, I grabbed the map the owner had provided and spread it on the table. I traced the route back to the main road, looking for reassurance that I could leave in the morning. But as I stared at the map, a cold realization washed over me. The cabin wasn't marked. The directions had led me here, but the map didn't acknowledge the cabin's existence. A chill ran down my spine. I flipped the map over, hoping for an explanation, but the back was blank. No contact number, no emergency instructions. Just a hand-drawn route leading to nowhere. The whispers turned into voices. They were still faint, but now I could make out fragmented phrases. Leave, not safe, they're coming. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the cabin was empty. The fire had gone out, leaving only embers and a faint glow. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. I decided to leave. I packed my bag in a frenzy, throwing in clothes and supplies. As I stepped outside, the forest felt alive. The trees seemed closer, their branches arching toward me like grasping hands. The air was heavy, pressing against my chest with every step. The path back to the gravel road was gone. I shone my flashlight through the trees, searching for the oak with the scarred trunk. But the forest had swallowed it. Every direction looked the same, an endless maze of dark, towering trees. The voices were louder now, coming from all around me. Some were pleading, others mocking. I spun in circles, trying to locate the source, but the darkness was impenetrable. Then I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the light. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, then pointed toward the cabin. I turned and ran. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far I ran, I ended up back at the clearing. The cabin loomed before me, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. Desperation clawed at my mind. I'd heard of stories like this, people lost in the woods who claimed to be trapped by forces beyond understanding. I shouted into the night, my voice cracking, but the whispers only grew louder in response. I fell to my knees, clutching the map, now damp with sweat and trembling hands. Suddenly, a cold gust blew the cabin door wide open. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside, driven by some mix of resignation and the hope of answers. The interior had changed. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though alive. Furniture was no longer where I had left it. The table had shifted to the center of the room, and on it lay a single object, a journal. I hesitated, then picked it up. The leather cover was worn, the pages brittle and yellowed. Scrawled across the first page were the words, "To those who come after me, may this guide you where I failed." The entries were fragmented, written in a frantic, uneven hand. They spoke of the same whispers, the same figure. One entry caught my eye. "They are drawn to your fear. The more you fight, the tighter the trap becomes. Trust nothing." As I read, the shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, coalescing into shapes that defied reason. Faces emerged, hollow and anguished, their mouths forming silent screams. The journal fell from my hands as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. I bolted for the door, but the figure stood in the doorway, blocking my escape. Its featureless face seemed to ripple, as if something inside it was trying to break free. It raised a hand, and the air around me grew heavy. My limbs refused to obey, and I collapsed to the floor. From somewhere deep in the forest came a sound, a low, guttural growl that shook the ground beneath me. The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was a hollow echo, layered with countless others. "You cannot leave. You are part of this now." The growl grew louder, and the floorboards beneath me splintered, revealing a chasm of darkness. Hands, skeletal and cold, reached up and pulled me down. The last thing I saw was the fire roaring back to life, its flames impossibly high, as the cabin disappeared into the void. And then, silence. When I woke, I was lying in a hospital bed. White walls, the steady beeping of a heart monitor, the hum of fluorescent lights. A nurse noticed I was awake and rushed over, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "We found you on the side of the highway," she said. "You were unconscious and dehydrated. How you got there, no one knows." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. Memories of the cabin flooded back, vivid and horrifying. I wanted to tell her, to warn someone, but I couldn't find the words. Later, when I was discharged, I searched for the listing online. It was gone. The emails I'd exchanged with the owner had vanished from my inbox. Even the map I'd clung to was missing from my belongings. I told myself it was over, that it had to be some bizarre hallucination. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear faint whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see the figure, standing just at the edge of the light. There's something inherently mysterious about trains. They're liminal spaces, carrying us from one point to another, often in the dead of night when the world feels its quietest. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks, and the dim, flickering lights of passing stations all lend themselves to a sense of otherworldliness. This story begins on one such train, a journey that promised nothing more than a peaceful night of travel but ended in a haunting enigma. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the rails had always been soothing to me. It was like a heartbeat, steady and constant, as the world outside the window blurred into a palette of night shadows and moonlit fields. I had chosen an overnight train for this journey, an efficient, peaceful way to travel. At least, that's what I had thought. I had boarded late, the platform bathed in the cold glow of fluorescent lights. My car was sparsely occupied, a few scattered figures hunched in their seats, lost in books or cocooned in sleep. I settled into my spot by the window, hugging my jacket tighter as the train lurched forward. It was an hour into the journey when I noticed the man sitting across the aisle from me. He must have boarded at the last stop because I was certain his seat had been empty earlier. His warm smile caught me off guard as our eyes met. "First time on a night train?" he asked, his voice gentle, friendly. I shook my head, returning the smile. "Not really, but it's been a while." "They're quite special, aren't they?" He leaned forward slightly. "Something about traveling through the dark, when most of the world is asleep, it's like you're between places. Almost outside of time." I nodded, not entirely sure how to respond. He seemed harmless, though, and his voice carried a certain charm that made me lower my guard. We talked for a while after that, about books, about travel, even the odd quirks of train etiquette. His name was Victor, he said, and he spoke with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. After a while, I excused myself to stretch my legs and visit the restroom. The train corridor was quiet, the occasional sway of the car forcing me to steady myself against the walls. The restroom was tiny, dimly lit, but serviceable. When I returned to my seat, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Victor was gone. At first, I thought he'd stepped away, just as I had. But his seat was missing, too. Where there had been a neatly arranged row of 2 seats across the aisle, there was now nothing but a smooth, unbroken expanse of wall. My stomach twisted. I stood there, blinking, convinced I was imagining things. "Excuse me," I asked an older woman seated a few rows ahead, "did you see where the man sitting here went?" She glanced up from her knitting, her expression puzzled. "There's never been a seat there, dear. Are you feeling all right?" Her words hit me like a cold wind. I turned back to the wall where the seat had been, running my hand along it as if I might find some hidden seam or latch that would explain this impossibility. Nothing. The wall was smooth, solid. Panic started to rise in my chest. I stumbled to the conductor's car, my words tumbling out in a rush as I explained what had happened. He frowned, skeptical, but followed me back to my seat. When we arrived, there was still no sign of Victor or the missing seat. "Miss, I don't know what to tell you," the conductor said, his tone tinged with impatience. "Maybe you fell asleep and dreamed it." "It wasn't a dream," I insisted, my voice trembling. "I talked to him. His name was Victor." The conductor's frown deepened. "Victor, you said?" I nodded, clutching my arms tightly to my chest. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the window as if considering something he didn't want to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. "A man named Victor disappeared from this train about 20 years ago. Same route, same car. Some folks say he's still. Well, let's just say strange things happen on these old trains at night." My blood ran cold. "What happened to him?" "Nobody knows," the conductor replied, his voice low. "One minute he was there, the next, gone. Just like you described." I barely slept for the rest of the journey. Every creak of the train, every shadow that flickered in the corner of my eye, set my nerves on edge. The once soothing rhythm of the wheels became an oppressive drumbeat, each turn of the train's path carrying me deeper into a mystery I couldn't escape. When I closed my eyes, I half expected to see Victor's face in the dark, his warm smile frozen in time. But there was nothing, just the ceaseless motion of the train as it sped into the night. When we finally pulled into the station, I bolted from the car, desperate to leave the nightmare behind. I barely registered the tired, groggy commuters around me as I stumbled onto the platform, the chill of the air biting into my skin. But as I hurried through the terminal, I felt it. A presence, a pair of eyes on me. My heart skipped a beat, and without thinking, I turned. For the briefest moment, I saw him. Victor. Standing just outside the crowd, his figure partially obscured by a group of people walking past. He was smiling that same warm, knowing smile, his eyes twinkling with an odd, distant light. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched me. And then, just as quickly, he vanished. He didn't fade into the crowd, it was as though he had never been there at all. No one else seemed to notice him, and yet I could still feel the weight of his gaze, like a shadow clinging to me. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it him, or was it my mind playing tricks on me? But the unsettling feeling didn't leave. It followed me as I left the station, my footsteps quickening with each passing moment. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night lingered like a heavy fog in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that I had been overtired, that the isolation of the train and the eerie atmosphere had simply led me to misinterpret what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. I could still see his face, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The way he seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, perhaps even me. I haven't taken a train since. And I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when I lie in bed with the world outside still and quiet, I hear it, the soft, rhythmic clatter of train wheels against the rails. It's distant at first, almost imperceptible, but it grows louder, closer. And in the silence that follows, I swear I can hear a voice, faint and familiar, calling my name from the shadows. It's been months since that fateful journey, but I still wonder. Could Victor have been a ghost, trapped between the dimensions of the living and the dead? Or was he something more, a messenger, a warning, perhaps, of the things that linger in places we don't understand? The only thing I know for sure is this: I've learned to listen closely to the hum of the world around me, to the things that seem out of place. And every time I hear the sound of distant train wheels, I feel a shiver run down my spine, knowing that sometimes, the past is not as far behind as we think. It had been a long, exhausting day, and all I wanted was to make it home. The road stretched out before me, winding through the desolate countryside. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and darkness had quickly claimed the landscape. I was driving alone, just me and the soft hum of the tires on the asphalt. The headlights illuminated a narrow path through the thickening shadows, the only light in an otherwise endless black. I had already passed several signs that warned of no services for miles. A part of me wished I had taken the longer route that passed through small towns, but I was eager to get home. My phone had no signal, the radio crackled with static, and the silence of the road seemed almost suffocating. It was the kind of isolation that made you feel like you were the last person on Earth, disconnected from everything familiar. The car seemed to vibrate with the emptiness around me, and every mile that passed made the night seem colder. The eerie quiet of the landscape was only broken by the occasional flutter of wind against the trees. Nothing to distract me. Nothing to remind me of the world I had left behind. Then, out of nowhere, I saw him. A lone figure, standing at the edge of the road, his thumb raised to the sky in the universal sign of the hitchhiker. He seemed almost like a mirage, appearing out of the emptiness. The headlights caught him for just a split second, illuminating his pale face, gaunt and drawn, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His clothes were ragged, stained with dirt, and his hair hung in tangled strands. For a moment, I wondered if he was real or just some trick of the dimming light. Something about the scene unsettled me, but the thought of being alone on that road for the next hour pushed me to slow down. I hesitated, unsure whether I should just keep driving, but the growing unease in my chest was overshadowed by a sense of responsibility. There was no telling how far he'd come or how long he'd been standing there. The road ahead was long and deserted, and surely, there was no harm in offering a ride. I rolled the window down, half expecting a voice full of desperation, but instead, it was only his hollow stare that met me. His lips were cracked, and his eyes never blinked. He just looked at me as though I were an object, not a person. The air around him seemed colder, heavier. "You need a lift?" I asked, trying to hide the slight tremor in my voice. He didn't speak at first. He simply stared. A long, uncomfortable moment passed, and I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer at all. Then, he nodded. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Without a word, he opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. I didn't know what to make of it. I glanced at him again as he buckled his seatbelt, his movements stiff and deliberate. His hands folded neatly in his lap. His clothes were torn, and he smelled faintly of mildew, but I told myself not to judge him. He was just a person in need of help, right? "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window at the passing dark landscape. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he spoke, his voice low and distant, like it came from far away. "Anywhere. Just keep driving." I swallowed hard, feeling a chill creep down my spine. His voice was strange, distant, detached, as if he were speaking from a place far beyond the car, beyond time itself. I decided not to push for more conversation. The road ahead stretched endlessly, and the silence between us grew more oppressive with each passing minute. I turned the radio on, hoping to fill the air with something familiar, but the static only grew louder. It was as if the radio itself were rejecting the silence. The eerie stillness settled over us, thicker than before. My eyes kept drifting back to him, but he never moved. His face was pale in the dim light, his eyes fixed on the window as though he were watching something that only he could see. The road became even darker as we drove, and I had to strain to make out the winding curves of the highway. The occasional streetlight flashed past, its yellow glow barely cutting through the dark. It felt as though the world was closing in around us, the car becoming smaller and smaller in the vast emptiness. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as the tension in the air mounted. That's when I noticed it, the shadow. At first, it was subtle. A shape that moved along the pavement just outside my peripheral vision. I thought it was just a trick of the light, the shadows stretching and shifting with the movement of the car. But as I drove on, the shape grew darker, more distinct. It moved with the car, staying just a few feet to the right, as though it were pacing alongside me. I glanced out the window, but there was nothing there. The shadow didn't match the car's movement. It wasn't the shadow of the headlights. It seemed separate, its form shifting unnaturally. My heart started to race. I turned to look at the hitchhiker, but his face remained unchanged. His eyes were still fixed on the window, as if he couldn't hear me. Or worse, didn't care to. The shadow surged forward, twisting and slithering alongside us, and I felt my heart leap into my throat. You need to get out," I said, my voice shaking with fear. "This isn't right." Get out of the car." He didn't respond. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. It was an expression that didn't belong on a human face, cold, predatory. The smirk widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, too white. "You should have kept driving," he whispered. His voice was no longer distant. It was sharp, right beside my ear. "Now you can't escape." I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The shadow seemed to grow with the car's acceleration, clawing at the sides, growing darker, more invasive. The headlights flickered, and the car bucked under the weight of it, as though the shadow were pulling us backward into the darkness. Desperation surged through me. I glanced at the hitchhiker one last time, and when I did, he was gone. Vanished. There was nothing in the passenger seat but empty space, and yet I could still feel him, his presence pressing against me from every direction. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow was all around us now, filling the car with its suffocating darkness. My vision began to blur, and the world tilted. I couldn't tell if I was still on the road, or if I was falling into the blackness. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The shadow was gone. The hitchhiker was gone. The car was still. I had no idea where I was. No idea how much time had passed. The road had disappeared into an endless abyss, and all that remained was a feeling, a gnawing, chilling sense of dread that clung to me. I pulled the car over to the side of the road, heart pounding in my chest, sweat dripping down my face. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I wanted to get out. I wanted to leave. But I couldn't move. It was as if my body was paralyzed by some unseen force. And then, just when I thought it was over, I saw it. In the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker. He was standing there, just beyond the car, his figure faint and blurry, like a twisted reflection. But this time, his eyes were different. They were wide open, black holes of emptiness that swallowed the light. And they were staring right at me. A voice echoed in my head, but it wasn't just the voice of the hitchhiker. It was a chorus of whispers, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "It's never over." I slammed the car into gear and drove off, my foot pressing the gas pedal with all the strength I had left. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always behind me. Watching. Waiting. And as I looked in the rearview mirror, I knew the truth: I wasn't alone. Not anymore. It was supposed to be a simple escape. A chance to disconnect from everything, the relentless noise of the city, the constant hum of expectations, the weight of unspoken regrets. The mountains had always called to me, their silent majesty offering the promise of peace, or so I thought. I'd been hiking before, but nothing like this. This was remote, untouched, a place where few ventured. And so, when I found a local guide, Malin, to help me navigate the wild, I felt it would be the perfect way to find solace. He seemed like the perfect choice at first, a rugged man, hardened by the harsh elements of the land he knew so well. His quiet demeanor and steady presence made him seem trustworthy. But there was something unsettling about his eyes. Something knowing. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was more like he was reading me, dissecting me in ways I couldn't understand. But I pushed those feelings aside, eager to leave behind my burdens and lose myself in the wilds of the mountains. Little did I know, I wasn't just running for my life, I was running into a nightmare I could never escape. The guide who knew too much. The guide who saw through my carefully constructed facade, who could unravel my deepest secrets without ever having met me before. The morning of our hike, the air was still, the sky overcast, heavy clouds hanging low. We met at the edge of the trailhead, where the forest began to swallow the path. Malin was already waiting, standing by the edge of a dense grove, his dark silhouette almost blending into the shadows of the trees. He greeted me with a simple nod, his expression unreadable. I attempted a small smile, but it faltered when I noticed how his eyes seemed to search me, piercing through the layers I had so carefully built. "You sure you're ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady, almost like a rumbling echo from somewhere deep within the mountains. It wasn't a question of physical preparedness. It felt more like he was asking if I was ready for something far deeper, something I couldn't put into words. I nodded, though my stomach churned. "Yeah. I'm ready." Without another word, he turned and began to walk, leading me into the dense thicket of trees. The trail was uneven, the earth beneath my boots soft and wet, the air thick with the scent of moss and earth. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just an unsettling, oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. As we moved, I noticed that Malin didn't speak much. His presence was like a shadow, always just there, always watching. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the towering trees, the distant peaks draped in fog, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was something strange about the way he carried himself, like he was both part of the landscape and somehow entirely separate from it. After a few hours of hiking, he stopped suddenly, his body stiffening, eyes scanning the trees. "You're nervous," he said without looking at me. It wasn't a question. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. How could he possibly know that? I had been trying to keep my anxiety at bay, pushing it down as we walked deeper into the mountains. But somehow, he seemed to feel it, to sense it in the air. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little too sharp. But he didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned to face me, his gaze penetrating. "You always think you can outrun it," he said softly, his words threading through the silence like a slow poison. "But you can't. Not here. Not in this place." A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the hike, the isolation, or something else entirely. Something far more personal. But before I could say anything, he started walking again, as if nothing had happened. I followed, my thoughts swirling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The deeper we went, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The trees grew taller, their twisted limbs reaching like gnarled hands toward the sky. The air grew thick, heavy with moisture, and I began to feel a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. "How long have you lived here?" I asked, trying to break the growing tension. Malin's answer was a simple shrug. "Long enough to know what's hidden in these woods." His words lingered in the air, carrying a weight that made me uneasy. There was something ancient about him, something that spoke of secrets buried deep within the earth, secrets the forest had kept for generations. After what felt like hours, we stopped again. This time, we were at a clearing, a small, almost unnatural space in the forest, the ground covered in a thick layer of fog that seemed to come from nowhere. It was silent here, but the silence was different. It felt suffocating, like the land itself was holding its breath. "Take a seat," Malin said, his voice strangely calm. "We've been walking for a while. You need to rest." I hesitated. The air was thick with something I couldn't name, something dark that seemed to press in on me. But I sat anyway, my body aching from the hike, my nerves frayed. Malin sat across from me, his back straight, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, without warning, he spoke. "You were in a car accident when you were 17. You never told anyone, but I know about it." My heart stopped. The words hit me like a physical blow. That was a secret I had buried so deep that I had nearly forgotten it myself. A night of reckless driving. A mistake. A collision that nearly cost someone their life, and mine, too. It was a night I'd never spoken of to anyone, not even to my closest friends. And yet, somehow, Malin knew. I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel my breath quickening, my chest tightening. "What are you talking about?" I managed to rasp. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've never forgiven yourself for it, have you? The guilt has eaten at you for years. You think you can escape it. But you can't. Not from me. Not from this place." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, suffocated by his knowledge, by his presence. How could he know this? How could he know things that no one else did? "You've been running for so long," he continued, his voice soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. "But there's no escape, you know. Not from what's inside you. Not from what you've done." Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Instead, I stood abruptly, turning away from him. My mind was spinning, my body frozen in fear. I had to get away, had to escape the suffocating weight of his words. But when I turned, the fog had thickened, swallowing up the clearing, the trees, the path. There was no way back. And when I looked around, I realized with growing horror that Malin was no longer sitting. He was standing behind me, his face inches from mine, his breath hot against my ear. "You can't outrun me," he whispered, his voice no longer calm but filled with a chilling finality. "You can't outrun your past. It's already here." The fog closed in, and the whispers of the forest grew louder, more urgent. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shift, the earth moving, breathing. The trees closed in around me like hands reaching out, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the guide who had led me here was not just a man, he was something else. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for me, for my guilt, for my secrets. And now, I was trapped. The fog thickened, and I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but it was like breathing through water. The weight of Malin's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, crushing every ounce of resistance I had left. I turned to face him, but there was nothing human in his eyes anymore. They were dark, voids of blackness, and in them, I saw everything, every mistake, every lie, every dark corner of my soul I tried so hard to bury. His gaze pierced through me like a knife, exposing the raw, festering wound of my guilt. "You think you're the only one who carries their sins?" Malin's voice came, no longer a whisper but a cold, harsh reality. "You think this is just your burden? This place, it feeds on guilt. It thrives on it. And you're not the first to wander in here, lost in your shame." My legs trembled, the ground beneath me shifting like it was alive, alive with the sins of those who had come before me. The trees seemed to move, bending and twisting like a web closing in, their branches reaching for me, clawing at my skin. I stumbled backward, the chill creeping into my bones. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But where would I go? The path was gone, swallowed by the fog. The trees were no longer just trees, they were alive, and they were closing in. The mountains, once so beautiful, now seemed to be pulsing with an ancient, terrible energy. Malin took a slow step toward me, his form distorting with the fog. "You're not leaving this place, not without facing the truth." Suddenly, a memory I'd buried long ago surfaced, my father, his face twisted in anger, his departure, the words he never spoke but left behind. I had blamed myself for everything that happened after he left, blamed myself for the things I had done to escape the pain of losing him. It wasn't just the car accident. It was every wrong turn I'd made, every choice that had brought me here. Tears stung my eyes as I realized the truth. I had never faced what I had done. I had never forgiven myself. I had thought running away, hiding from it all, would make it go away. But the guilt had been festering, waiting for this moment. Waiting for me to face it. Malin's figure grew more solid now, his presence a looming shadow that towered over me. His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. There is no escaping yourself, no escaping what you carry inside. I dropped to my knees, the weight of everything pressing down on me, the guilt, the fear, the sorrow. I had never been free. I had never truly escaped. And then, as if on cue, the forest fell silent. The weight lifted, the fog parting just enough for me to see the dim light of the distant peaks, the world outside this nightmare. But I knew it was a trick, a final deception. Malin stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "There's no going back now," he whispered. I closed my eyes, the darkness swallowing me whole. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was lost in my own mind, trapped in a place where the past never truly let go. The guide, the mountains, the fog, everything had led me here, to confront what I had been running from all my life. I had walked into the wilderness to find peace, to escape my past. But what I had found instead was something far more terrifying, the truth I could never outrun. And as the trees closed in, as the fog began to swallow me whole, I understood, Malin had never been the one to lead me here. I had always been the one guiding myself. The mountains, the forest, the guilt, they had been waiting for me all along. It was supposed to be an ordinary stop in my travels, a quick, unremarkable night in a crowded hostel in a foreign city. I had been hopping from one place to the next for weeks, meeting strangers in common spaces, sharing stories over beers, and trying to make the most of the whirlwind adventure. My current room was a cramped, no-frills dorm, with peeling paint on the walls and the hum of traffic leaking in through the windows. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, but then again, that's when the bizarre happens, isn't it? When you least expect it. I had arrived the night before, bleary-eyed from a long bus ride, and quickly found my bunk. It wasn't ideal, a top bunk that smelled faintly of mildew, but it was fine for a few hours of sleep. My roommate, a girl with dark, frizzy hair and a bright smile, introduced herself as Sophia. She seemed friendly enough, chatty in that way backpackers are, constantly on the move, constantly shifting between destinations. I was half listening when she told me about her plans to visit the old cathedral in the morning. "Hey, if you want to come with, I'm heading out early," she had said with an easy grin, though I had politely declined. I wasn't in the mood for sightseeing that early in the morning, and I preferred to sleep in. She had waved it off, mentioning something about how she loved to explore by herself anyway. We both drifted off, and when I woke, I thought I'd be starting my day like any other, until I found the bed across from me completely empty. At first, I figured she'd just gone out for a walk or a run, as she had planned. But as the minutes passed, I began to feel that nagging sense of unease that often comes with unfamiliar places. I glanced over at her bed again, empty, the blanket pulled neatly across the mattress. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. Perhaps she had gotten up really early, or maybe she had already checked out. There was no note, no indication of where she had gone. I rubbed my eyes, sat up, and checked the time, 9:30 a.m. That was odd. We'd talked about meeting for breakfast at 10. My stomach growled, and I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, standing up. I walked to the window, but the street outside was quieter than I'd expected. The morning had an almost eerie stillness to it, the usual sounds of the bustling city muffled as though the world had been paused for a moment. I decided to go down to the front desk. Maybe the staff knew where she had gone. I slipped on my shoes, grabbing my bag as I left the room, locking the door behind me. The hallway was still and quiet, the faded carpet worn from years of travelers' footsteps. The reception area downstairs was equally empty, except for the woman behind the counter. She was typing away at her computer, her face illuminated by the dull glow of the screen. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. "Excuse me, have you seen my roommate? Her name's Sophia. She's not in the room. I was wondering if maybe she checked out early or something." The woman didn't look up, her fingers continuing to tap at the keys as she replied in a monotone voice. "There was no one else in your room." My stomach twisted. "No, what? She was there last night. We shared the room." The woman's eyes finally lifted from her screen, locking onto mine with an almost too practiced blankness. "There is only one guest in that room. You. Perhaps you are mistaken." I stood there, frozen. The room felt suddenly too small, and I felt the air around me press in, thickening as my mind scrambled for an explanation. She had to be wrong. I knew Sophia was there. We had talked before bed, laughed about something silly. She couldn't have disappeared like that. But she was there last night. I talked to her. My voice faltered as I tried to grasp at the edges of the memory, but it all seemed to slip away. The receptionist simply stared at me, unblinking. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of anyone else. You're the only one in that room. Maybe you're mistaken." I wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but I found myself backing away instead. There was something about her voice, her tone, that unnerved me more than I could explain. It wasn't just indifference, it was something darker, something knowing. I turned and left the lobby without another word, my mind spinning. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking maybe I had misremembered something. Maybe Sophia had left while I was still asleep. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. If she had left, why wouldn't she have told me? Why was there no trace of her anywhere? I returned to the room, the door creaking open of its own accord as I stepped inside. The bed was still made, the blanket pulled taut as if no one had slept in it at all. My heart thudded in my chest as I looked around. I walked to the window, peering out into the streets below, but there was no sign of her. The city had returned to its usual buzz, people walking by without a care. I wondered if they knew the secret of this place, the one that was starting to settle in my gut like an anchor. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to collect myself, but that's when I noticed something odd. There, in the corner of the room near the bed, something was out of place. A faint smell lingered in the air, a perfume, sweet yet stale, like it hadn't been worn in years. It was heavy, cloying, and it made my skin crawl. I turned to the source of the smell, my eyes scanning the corner where the light barely reached. And there, wedged between the floorboards, was a small piece of paper. My heart skipped, and I almost didn't want to touch it. But I found my hand reaching for it, pulling it free from the crack. I unfolded it, my hands shaking. Asterisk, please, don't look for me. I'm not here anymore. Asterisk. The words were hastily scribbled, as if written in a panic, the ink smudged in places. My eyes ran over the sentence again and again, the room around me seeming to grow colder with each word. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't some traveler's joke. Something had happened here. Something terrible. I dropped the paper as though it had burned me. The air in the room felt suffocating now, the silence too loud, and I could almost hear her voice, Sophia's voice, but it wasn't a memory. It was an echo, faint but growing stronger. "Please, don't look for me." I rushed out of the room, the walls closing in around me as I stumbled down the hall. The hostel seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if the hallway went on forever, never ending. I reached the stairs, only to find the woman from the desk standing there, watching me with that same emotionless gaze. And suddenly, I knew. I wasn't going to find Sophia. No one would ever find her. Because she had never really been here in the first place. I wasn't the only one in this room. I was the next one to vanish. As I turned to flee, I heard her voice again, this time clearer. "You shouldn't have stayed." The words were soft but chilling. I looked around, but no one was there. The hallway stretched in all directions, empty and silent. I tried to push through the door, but it wouldn't open. I pulled harder, the handle cold under my palm. It was locked. The entire hostel seemed to groan with an ancient, unseen weight. I turned back toward the reception desk, but when I looked up, the woman was no longer there. And then the realization hit me, there was no escape. I had been swallowed by the place, just like Sophia. And as the walls around me began to close in, I understood. I was never leaving. The lights flickered, and then, complete darkness. I had been on the road for hours, the endless highway stretching before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desolate countryside. I wasn't in a rush, just a lone road trip, seeking the quiet escape that only the open road could offer. It had been days since I had seen another car, and the isolation felt strangely soothing. The rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, and the wind whistling through the cracks in my window were my only company. My thoughts drifted in and out, lost in the hypnotic cadence of the miles slipping by. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and purple, I started to feel a pull, a desire for something more. A small village appeared on the map, a speck on the edge of nowhere, with a name I couldn't quite pronounce. It promised a break from the solitude, a brief respite before the long night ahead. I took the turnoff, my tires crunching against the gravel as the road wound deeper into the landscape. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like fingers, casting long shadows that stretched across the path. The air grew cooler, and a quiet unease stirred within me. There was something off about this place, but I pushed the thought aside. It was just a village, a quiet little town, how strange could it be? As I neared the village, the first thing that struck me was the eerie silence. There were no sounds, no cars, no distant chatter, not even the familiar rustling of leaves in the wind. The street signs were faded, but there were no people in sight, and the houses appeared to be nestled together like forgotten relics. Even the trees that lined the road stood unnaturally still. It felt as though the world had been paused, as if the village was holding its breath. The town appeared picturesque, almost too perfect. The houses were small but well kept, their windows gleaming under the fading light, their gardens full of vibrant flowers in bloom. It could have been a place from a travel brochure, a hidden gem in the countryside. The streets were lined with cobblestone, the kind you'd expect to find in an old European town. Everything was in order, and yet, there was something unsettling about the stillness that clung to the air. I pulled into the only parking spot outside a small general store. The sound of the engine dying in the quiet air was strangely loud, like the world was suddenly aware of my presence. The store was old, with weathered wooden beams and a sign hanging above the door that creaked gently in the breeze. I pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming faintly, but there was no response. "Hello?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. It echoed through the shop, but there was no answer. The shelves were stocked with goods, but the place felt abandoned. There were no other customers, no shopkeeper behind the counter. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something sour lingered in the corners. I wandered further into the store, but every turn only deepened my unease. I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. My skin prickled, and my thoughts began to cloud with irrational fears. Why had I driven so far out of my way for this place? And why did it feel like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to understand? I turned to leave, but as I stepped out the door, I noticed something strange. The village was even quieter than before. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I glanced around, seeing that a handful of people had appeared on the street. They moved slowly, walking in the same direction, their faces pale and expressionless. An elderly woman with her head bent low, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, passed by without a glance. A man carrying a large bundle over his shoulder, his eyes staring straight ahead, walked silently past me. The few others I saw looked just as odd, robotic, almost as if they were on some kind of preordained path. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to make eye contact with one of them, but they seemed to ignore me entirely, as if I wasn't even there. The more I looked around, the more unsettling it became. There were no children playing in the streets, no sounds of laughter or music. No one was walking their dogs, no one was sitting outside for a drink. It was as though the village was waiting for something. But what? I started to feel the pull to follow the crowd, an instinct I couldn't quite explain. I joined the procession, keeping a safe distance, my feet moving almost on their own as I walked down the main street. The sky had darkened, the sun nearly gone, and the village seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the night. The villagers were walking toward the center of the town, and as I approached, I noticed a strange, large stone monument in the square. There were a dozen or so people gathered around it, their heads lowered in what appeared to be deep concentration. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but my feet carried me forward, unable to stop. My curiosity gnawed at me. What were they doing? As I got closer, I saw that the monument was actually a stone altar, its surface slick with something that gleamed in the moonlight. I could barely make out the shapes of offerings, bundles of flowers, strange symbols carved into the stone. The villagers had formed a circle around it, chanting in low, rhythmic voices. The sound was unnerving, as though it was coming from everywhere at once, resonating in my chest. The air had grown unnaturally cold, the chill creeping into my bones. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. The chanting intensified, and I could feel the ground beneath me trembling slightly, as if the earth itself was waking up. I took a step back, my heart racing. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft and almost drowned out by the chant. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, looking for the source of the voice, but saw no one. The villagers continued their ritual, oblivious to my presence. But the voice had been clear, terribly clear, and it felt like it had come from inside my head. Then, something changed. The air grew thick with something dark, a presence that I could feel creeping around the edges of my consciousness. I looked up, and there, emerging from the shadows, was a tall figure. It was cloaked in black, its form almost impossible to make out in the dim light. The villagers parted for it, moving aside as if in reverence, their faces blank, their bodies rigid. The figure approached the altar, its long, bony hands outstretched. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Everything inside me screamed to run, but my legs were frozen in place. The figure knelt by the altar, its hands hovering over the offerings, and the chant grew louder. The villagers' voices merged into one, an unholy sound that made my stomach churn. The earth beneath me rumbled again, this time stronger, and a crack appeared in the stone beneath the figure's hands. It was happening. In that moment, I understood. The ritual wasn't for the land, or for the harvest, or for some ancient tradition. It was for something far darker, a presence that had been waiting. The village had been preparing for this moment, for the coming of whatever this figure was summoning. I broke free from my paralysis and ran. My legs moved faster than I ever thought possible, my heart pounding in my ears as I sprinted back to my car. I could hear the chanting behind me, growing louder with each step, as though they were following me, calling me to return. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the village, my tires screeching on the gravel road as I sped away. The village, the people, the altar, all disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. And I knew, deep down, that the village wasn't done with me. It would never let me forget. As I sped down the winding road, the village quickly faded from view, swallowed by the growing darkness. My heart was still pounding, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The adrenaline coursed through me like a wildfire, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the images, the faces of those silent villagers, the dark figure by the altar, the earth trembling beneath me, refused to leave my mind. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the faint glow of the village's street lamps, or the shadowy outline of those strange, motionless figures trailing behind me. But nothing. Just the empty, dark stretch of road. Yet even as the miles passed, and I convinced myself I was out of danger, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That I was being followed. Hours later, I reached the main highway, and the familiar hum of the engine was the only sound once more. I should have felt relief. I should have been able to breathe again. But I couldn't. The fear hadn't left me. It had lodged itself in my bones, a constant, gnawing presence in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the dashboard. I had pulled into a small, run-down motel along the highway, too exhausted from the night's events to go any further. The screen flashed with a notification from the navigation app one had used to get to the village. My fingers froze as I stared at it. The village, the one that I thought I had left behind, was still there. I opened the map and zoomed in, half expecting to see nothing. But there it was. The same little village, marked with a name I had never heard of before. A name that didn't make sense to me. The app didn't even recognize it. And yet, there it was, right where it had been the night before. My pulse quickened. I opened my messages, thinking I might find something to explain this, a simple explanation for my unease. Maybe it was just a glitch. Maybe I had simply imagined it all. But when I checked my photos, I froze. There was a picture on my phone. It was a photo I didn't remember taking. A dark, blurry image of the village square, the stone monument just barely visible in the background. But the most chilling detail was what stood at the center of the altar, a shadowy figure. Its face, obscured by a black hood, but its hands, long, claw-like fingers, were unmistakable. It was standing, watching me through the lens, as if it had known I would capture it. I scrolled through my phone in a frantic haze, trying to find some sense of reality in the digital files, but the photos were all the same. The village, the altar, the dark figure, each one growing clearer, the details more precise with every image. And then, I saw it. The last photo, taken just moments before I fled, my own face. But my eyes were different. Hollow, empty, as if I had become one of them. A village bound to its secrets, its rituals, its silence. I slammed my phone down, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. There was no escaping it. The village had left its mark on me, a dark stain in my memory that I couldn't wipe away. The worst part. The name of the village on the map. It had changed. It no longer read as it had the night before. It was something else now, something unfamiliar, but undeniable. The name of the village was mine. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I had never really left. It had followed me. The silence. The shadows. The people. They were all waiting. And no matter how far I drove, no matter how many miles I put between me and that cursed place, it would always be there, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, waiting for the day it would call me back. Because once you step foot in the silent village, you can never truly escape. You just become part of its story. It had been a long day of driving, the road stretching endlessly beneath the dim glow of my headlights. The highway was desolate, and the clock on the dashboard showed it was past midnight. My gas light flickered on, a silent reminder that I needed to stop soon. I hadn't seen another car in hours, and the idea of driving for miles without finding a place to refuel sent a jolt of anxiety through me. The hum of the tires on the road seemed to deepen the quiet of the night, and the darkness outside felt too vast. That's when I spotted it, an old, run-down gas station, half hidden in the shadows of some long-forgotten forest. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, rusted pumps, faded signage, and an old, creaking roof that sagged under the weight of time. Still, it was my only option. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as I slowly came to a stop. My car's engine sputtered to a halt, and I hesitated before stepping out. The night air was cold and thick with the smell of damp earth, and an unease settled in my chest. I glanced around, half expecting to see another car pull in behind me, but the place was completely empty. The silence was unnerving. Not a single sound from the woods. No rustling of leaves, no distant howl of an animal. Just a thick, unsettling quiet. I grabbed my wallet and walked to the door of the station, the bell above it jingling as I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, like something had been closed off for years. Dust clung to the shelves, and the floor creaked underfoot. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. Behind the counter, a man sat hunched over, his back to me. The faint glow of a dim desk lamp highlighted the edges of his figure, but his face was obscured by the shadows. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should say something, when he suddenly looked up. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, like someone who hadn't slept in days. There was a strange, hollow emptiness to them, like a vacuum that sucked the warmth out of the room. "Can I help you?" His voice was raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in days. I swallowed hard, trying to push aside the growing feeling of unease. "Just need to fill up." He nodded slowly, his movements sluggish, like each gesture was a conscious effort. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cup of coffee, taking a slow, deliberate sip, his gaze never leaving mine. His fingers curled around the cup with an unnatural tightness, as if he were trying to hold on to something. I shifted from foot to foot, nervously glancing around. There was something off about the place, something that felt wrong. The shelves behind the counter were stocked with outdated snacks and dusty cans, but there was no sign of any recent activity. No newspapers, no signs of life beyond the man in front of me. It was as though time had stopped here, frozen in the middle of nowhere. "Is this place still open?" I asked, trying to make conversation to ease the tension. He didn't respond immediately, instead continuing to stare at me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You're the first, in a long time." His voice was low, almost too quiet, as if he were afraid to say it aloud. My stomach twisted. "I don't mean to pry," I said, glancing at the gas pumps outside, "but why's that?" He looked past me, as if he were trying to focus on something I couldn't see. "No one stops here anymore. No one that's still alive, that is." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. I froze. "What do you mean?" My voice caught in my throat, but I couldn't pull myself away. The strange chill in the air had wrapped around me, making it impossible to look away. The man's eyes flickered, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. But it wasn't a pleasant one, it was jagged, like a mask too tight for his face. "It's better you don't know." I took a step back, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, a deep, gnawing fear creeping up from the pit of my stomach. The urge to leave was overwhelming, but some strange force, kept me rooted to the spot. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, I heard a faint sound, like footsteps echoing from somewhere in the back of the station. The sound was too soft to be heard clearly, but it was unmistakable. Something, was moving behind the walls. I turned, my eyes darting toward the hallway that led deeper into the building. The hairs on my arms prickled. The man behind the counter hadn't moved, but his face was twisted in a look of pure, desperate fear. "You should leave," he rasped, his voice shaking. I nodded, my feet carrying me toward the door. But just as I reached for the handle, I froze. The door was locked. I pulled harder, panic rising in my throat as I yanked again, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, more than one set this time, moving closer, their rhythm slow and deliberate. I spun around to face the cashier, but he was no longer standing behind the counter. He was gone. My heart hammered in my chest as the door began to rattle. Someone, or something, was on the other side, trying to push its way in. I could hear it now, ragged breathing, scraping sounds like nails against wood. The hairs on my neck stood on end as the room grew colder, darker, as though the shadows themselves were closing in on me. Desperately, I turned to run for the back exit, but the hallway was filled with figures now, shapes that moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing in the dim light. They were not human. Their faces were contorted, twisted, their limbs too long, too thin, and their mouths stretched open in grotesque, silent screams. One of them stepped forward. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but my feet wouldn't move fast enough. I was trapped. The figures crept closer, their eyes boring into me, and the last thing I heard before everything went dark was the rasping voice of the cashier from behind me. "You shouldn't have stopped here." The world blurred, and I fell into darkness, the shadows closing in on me, wrapping me in their cold embrace. I woke up hours later. The car was still parked at the station, the gas pump still showing the exact amount I'd put in. But when I looked around, the station was empty. Silent. The only thing that remained was the faint smell of something decaying in the air. I drove away, my foot heavy on the gas pedal, my hands shaking. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw someone, standing in the distance, watching me. "No one stops here," the man had said. And now, I understood why. I didn't stop for miles, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. The road stretched out ahead of me, but the darkness seemed to follow, clinging to the edges of my vision. My mind raced with what I had seen, or thought I had seen, back at that gas station. Was it all just a nightmare? A trick of the mind after too many hours on the road? But I knew the truth. There was something wrong with that place, something far darker than I could ever explain. As the miles passed and the first rays of dawn began to creep across the horizon, I convinced myself that I had left it behind. The gas station, the strange cashier, the figures, they were all in the past, fading into the distance with every turn of the tires. I even found myself laughing nervously, shaking my head. It must have been the isolation, the exhaustion. Nothing more. But when I reached the next town, I decided to stop at a small diner to grab a coffee and calm my nerves. I stepped out of the car, still rattled but eager for some semblance of normalcy. As I pushed open the door to the diner, I heard the familiar jingle of a bell overhead. I froze. Behind the counter, the same cashier from the gas station was there, his eyes wide and hollow. He was smiling that twisted, chilling grin again, and he didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I looked around frantically, but there was no one else in the diner, no one to help, no one to stop him. In that instant, I knew the truth. It wasn't just the gas station that was cursed. It was me. And whatever that place had done to me, it had followed me, latched on, refusing to let me escape. The cashier's lips parted slowly, his voice like a whisper from the grave. You shouldn't have left. And just like that, I realized that no matter how far I drove, how fast I ran, I would never be free. The nightmare would follow me, forever. I thought this would be the perfect trip, a brief escape to explore new cities and soak in the unfamiliar. It was meant to be a quick getaway, a chance to disconnect and recharge before getting back to the grind. I had everything planned meticulously, from the tourist spots to the perfect time to catch my flight back home. But as the hours ticked down to my departure, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the last day, and I could almost feel the weight of the return ticket in my hand, a promise that soon I'd be back where I belonged. Little did I know, the journey home would not go as I expected. And it wouldn't end as I thought it would, either. I step into the airport, my heart light with anticipation of getting back to the comfort of my own bed. My flight's scheduled for 3:30 p.m., and I have plenty of time to catch it. The terminal is as bustling as ever, a hum of noise surrounding me, but for some reason, the air feels different, tense, almost. The check-in counter is busy, the agent at the desk smiling mechanically as she handles each passenger. When it's finally my turn, I hand her my passport and the return ticket, eager to breeze through the final steps. I've done this countless times before, and it's always been simple. But the moment I hand over the papers, I notice something strange in the agent's eyes. A flicker of confusion, maybe even suspicion, before her professional smile takes over. I'm afraid your information isn't in our system, she says. I blink, a lump forming in my throat. That's impossible, I reply, trying to steady my nerves. I booked this weeks ago. You have to have it. She glances at the screen and then back at me, her fingers lingering over the keyboard. I'm sorry, but your name doesn't appear here. Panic starts to stir in my chest, but I force it down. Check again. I have my ID right here. I slide my identification across the counter, hoping it will help clear this up. Her eyes flicker over it quickly, then she types again. Still nothing. You're sure this is the right flight? I ask, trying to stay calm, but the tremor in my voice betrays me. The agent's gaze softens, but there's a distance in it, as if she's looking through me. There's no record of you. Her voice is polite, but there's a strange finality to it. I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to step aside. We need to investigate this further. I open my mouth to argue, but her calm tone has a weight to it, something unnerving that makes me hesitate. I glance at the clock. Only 30 minutes until my flight departs. My stomach churns, but I nod, stepping aside reluctantly. As I stand there, the airport seems to grow eerily quiet. The hum of conversation, the footsteps of travelers, all of it fades into the background, replaced by the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong, but I can't quite put my finger on it. I'm just about to approach the counter again when a different agent steps up to me, a woman who looks older, her face tired, but kind. "We'll need to verify some details," she says gently. "Please follow me." I don't argue. What choice do I have? I'm already late, and the air feels like it's pressing in on me, making everything feel heavier. She leads me to a small side room, tucked away from the main area. There's a worn desk and an uncomfortable chair. It feels more like an interrogation room than a waiting area. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," she says, but her words ring hollow. "I'll need to take a moment to check everything. Please have a seat." I sit down, trying to steady my nerves. I check my phone, but there's no signal, odd, given the area I'm in. It's as if the whole place has been cut off from the outside world. A strange sense of dread crawls up my spine, and I glance at the door, but the woman is still standing by the counter, tapping away at her computer. Minutes pass. Then, 20. My heart begins to race. The clock on the wall ticks away, and I watch it like it's my only anchor in the chaos unfolding around me. There's a faint scraping noise from the hallway, like the shuffle of footsteps, and I turn to see a man standing in the doorway of the small room. He looks familiar. Too familiar. I can't place it, but the recognition slithers under my skin, an eerie sensation that sends a cold shiver down my spine. He's tall, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seem to see through me. He's dressed casually, but there's something off about his posture, something rigid, unnatural. "Excuse me," I say, trying to make sense of this situation. "Who are you?" He doesn't answer right away. He just stands there, his gaze locked on mine, like he's waiting for something. Finally, his lips part, and his voice is low, almost whispering. "You've been here before." I freeze. "What?" I manage, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I haven't." But his eyes don't shift, and that feeling, the one that had been crawling at the back of my mind for the last few minutes, settles in fully. A growing, choking fear wraps around my throat. His face is impassive, but there's something about it, something unsettling. His lips curl into a faint, almost pitying smile. "You were here. A long time ago," he says again, as if I should remember it. "I don't know you," I say firmly, but my voice falters. His smile deepens, and a cold wave rushes over me. "You told us you were leaving," he continues. "And now you've come back." He steps closer, his presence overwhelming the tiny room. "But it's too late. You were never supposed to come back." I stand up abruptly, my heart hammering. "What do you mean? I don't know you. I don't even remember you." The door swings open, and the older agent enters again. She doesn't look at me, her eyes locked on the man. "You shouldn't have allowed this," she mutters to him, her voice tinged with something like regret. I stumble back, my chest tightening. I look between the two of them, but neither speaks. They both just look at me, their expressions unreadable, almost like I'm something they've already given up on. "This isn't real," I whisper to myself. "This isn't real." But the man's voice interrupts me, sharp and cutting. "It's far too real for you to ignore now." The woman steps forward, her tone colder than before. "You left. You left and forgot. And now you can't leave again." I stare at her, confusion mixing with fear. What are you talking about? I'm just trying to go home. I need to go home. You are home, she says flatly. Her gaze is empty, distant. You never left. The airport around me begins to blur, the walls stretching and warping, the ceiling rising impossibly high. I can no longer tell where the room ends and the world begins. The floors seem to sway beneath my feet, and the air feels thick, suffocating. I try to move, but my legs won't obey. The man's face draws closer, his eyes locked on mine. You can't go back, he says softly. Not like this. You were never meant to leave. I look up at the board listing flights. 3:30 p.m. My flight. It's still there. But now, it's not a flight home. It's a flight to somewhere else. The number flickers and shifts, like it's mocking me. My name doesn't appear. It never did. And then, with a sudden jolt, I understand. There's no return ticket. There never was. I wake up. It's cold, and my body aches. I try to move but find I can't. Panic rises, and I take in my surroundings. The sterile walls of the room, the flickering overhead light, and the hum of machinery in the background. The airport is gone. I'm in a room I don't recognize. It's quiet, too quiet. I try to scream, but my voice is gone, lost somewhere inside me. The door opens, and the same man stands in the doorway, his expression unchanged. Welcome back, he says, his voice hollow. You never really left. The door closes behind him with a finality that echoes in my mind.